to own, use, and dispense with your property. I mean, those are some of the fundamental property rights. And so the right to use your property was subverted by this decision. And in that same, and again, over the last century, you've seen the expanded use of federal, state, and local permitting regimes. There on the local level, we're talking about things like building permits and zoning approvals, and at the federal and state level, we're talking about things like wetlands permits and the like. And and some of the other tools that we've seen expand are the use of exactions and special district regulations. So, along with zoning, we've got this whole other bundle of regulations that affect how people use their property rights, or excuse me, how they use their property. So, I mean, if you want to characterize modern land use regulation, you can basically say that that modern land use regulation uses public policy to mandate the private provision of public amenities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through this. So there are really, two key powers that we're talking about here in terms of government power to regulate or influence private property. We're talking about the eminent domain power. A lot of people are familiar with that. The intent behind the eminent domain power is to allow the taking of private property for a public use, and these are the traditional public uses that we all know about: roads, infrastructure, hospitals, parks, those kinds of things, with just compensation. But in reality, what's happened over the last century or so is that the idea of public use has really morphed into this, this amorphous, ambiguous concept of public purpose, where now a public purpose such as increasing tax revenue, like Steve Greenhow was talking about, is somehow seen as legitimate, a legitimate use or a justification for the use of eminent domain. And then another fundamental power of government is the police power. And again, there, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the intent there is to secure people's rights by prohibiting harms. To prevent your neighbor from doing something that spills over and influences you and affects you. And that's where the idea of nuisance-based regulation. We all sort of know what nuisances are: noise, pollution, things like that. Well, what's happened is that the police power has expanded tremendously over the last century, and so now the reality of the police power is that it's basically routinely used to restrict property rights for any number of circumstances that in which there's conduct being regulated that doesn't actually affect anyone else's rights. So there again, we're talking about zoning, we're talking about urban growth boundaries, habitat conservation. I mean, that list could be 5 pages long. Well, the good news is that the tide is starting to turn a little bit, and there's, over the last 2 years. I'll start with the most recent event, which was, everybody in this room has probably heard of the Kelo versus New London decision, and the Supreme Court upheld the use of eminent domain to seize private property for, economic development purposes. Again, it's that amorphous public purpose concept. But, the good news is that the outrage that generated spawned, a lot of action around the states, legislation, constitutional amendments. 30 states right now either have adopted legislation or have constitutional amendments in the works that are aimed at curbing that abuse. The other key event, and this is the one that is a little less, this did not get anywhere near the publicity that the Kelo decision did, but in a lot of ways it's a lot more significant, is Measure 30, Oregon's passage of ballot initiative Measure 37 in 2004. And what that did was protected property owners from regulatory takings. So what are regulatory takings? Regulatory takings are when government enacts regulations that prohibit property owners from using their property in otherwise legitimate ways without just compensation. And again, if I just flip back, this is what it's addressing this when government it's conduct that's not violating anyone else's rights. So, this is a misuse of the police power. Those on the property rights side would argue, because we're talking about things in which there's no harm done. It's just that a local government decides, well, we want some open space, and we're not going to go and actually buy the open space. What we'll do is we'll just regulate away, the ability of those property owners in that greenbelt area to develop their property. Whoa, there you go. We've got open space now. Well, I would argue that that type of regulation is more correctly viewed as just a twist on eminent domain. Because again, what we're talking about, these regulations are passed to, the result is that they create a public good that benefits society as a whole, except society's not paying for it. These property owners aren't being compensated. And so, those of us that would, more on the property rights side would say that these impacted property owners deserve compensation, just as you would find in eminent domain. So, here's a couple examples of regulatory takings. Again, this list could go on, but, the three main categories you could pull out would be land use restrictions, and you've got, variety zoning, open space regulations, special district ordinances like historic districts and wetland overlay zones and things like that. You've got public access requirements, which are basically exactions that government will take from developers to give public access, or sidewalk easements, basically getting the private sector to provide public amenities. And then you have denial of permit applications, and there we're talking about wetlands permits, mineral permits, those types of things. So what is Measure 37? To really talk about Measure 37, you have to look at what has been happening in Oregon over the last several decades. And in 1973, they passed Senate Bill 100, which basically led to the creation of the most aggressive state-run land use growth management system in the country. And this is sort of the spawning ground of the smart growth movement. So you've got decades of highly aggressive state and local land use regulation. You've basically got a Soviet model state, centrally driven planning system, starting from the state and it trickling down through the cities and counties. So what Measure 37 does, Measure 37 was basically a response to a lot of the abuses that were being seen there in Oregon. And what Measure 37 does is requires that when state or local government, it requires that they compensate landowners when land use restrictions reduce the value of private property. Or it gives governments the option of waiving the regulations in lieu of compensation. So you've got two options there. If you're going to pass that, open space ordinance, well, and that person's property is devalued, well, you've got two options there. Government can either pay compensation or they can just waive the application of that regulation to that specific property owner. Basically saying, you're exempt from this regulation. Now, there are some exemptions in Measure 37. It exempts nuisance laws and health and safety, building codes and pollution controls and things like that, and federally mandated regulations. But, the fundamental goal of Measure 37 was to reinstate the rights that property owners had when they bought their land. So if you are a property owner, you buy your land in 1950, you've got 10 acres and your intention was this is your nest egg, maybe you're going to sell off some parcels and maybe develop, build a couple of houses for your grandkids one day or something like that. And then, a few years later, the state comes along and, and passes this growth management system. Your county passes a regulation that, prevents that, basically downzones your property. Well, all of a sudden, you're stuck there holding the bag. The burden of paying for that public benefit that, the public generates through, or that they get through open space, all of a sudden you're there paying for it. You've lost your nest egg and you're stuck paying the bill. So Measure 37, it passed by a 61-39 margin. Even voters who, in Oregon, it's a traditionally blue state. You have a lot of voters who support, and John, knows this very well. A lot of voters there still support the idea of land use regulation, but at the same time, they realize that it's gone too far. So they passed Measure 37. So what you've got going on now are several initiatives on the ballot in several Western states right now that basically are attempting to capitalize on the momentum by both the Kelo backlash and the Measure 37. So what you're looking at there is really they're calling them Kelo plus measures because they address both eminent domain abuse and regulatory takings. So you're essentially looking at a comprehensive set of property rights protections. And so you've got, these Kilo Plus measures are on the ballot in 4 states right now: Arizona, California, Idaho, Montana. Montana, just this week, a judge has basically is invalidated at the district level. It's probably going to go through the courts on something on, I guess, procedural grounds on how the signatures were collected. I'm not familiar with all the details of that. Now in Washington, also this year, you have a regulatory takings only measure. That one's going to look a lot. It looks a lot like Measure 37. I mean, and all these measures, they differ in some of the specifics and how they would address these issues, but fundamentally they're addressing both eminent domain abuse and regulatory takings. So, understandably, the opposition is very focused on this regulatory takings element. I mean, on one hand, a lot of the municipal groups and the planners, they don't like the idea of eminent domain reform. But they're not going to go fight it tooth and nail, because it's a loser. It's a losing issue for them. Now, they're not saying that they won't fight, but their aggressiveness against these initiatives is really generated by the regulatory takings component, because that's their sacred cow. That's how they've gotten their agenda through. That's how all of these urban planning schemes and environmental regulations have passed. So what they're seeing now is the possibility of the end of the free lunch. They've had a free lunch for decades and decades, and they're scared. And so they're coming out forcefully against these initiatives. Okay, thank you. So let me just talk a couple of, these are the 2 key objections that you're hearing about the Kilo Plus initiatives. One is that these measures are going to roll back land use and environmental regulation. All of a sudden it's going to be a free-for-all again. And the truth is that these measures are, except with the exception of Washington, these measures are prospective only. So basically the existing regulatory regime will be left in place. So what they would do then is that they will protect the rights as they exist today for property owners, so that if government comes tomorrow and tries to pass a regulation that would downzone your property or something like that, that would be when these provisions would kick in. So, and government can still regulate. Nothing prevents government from enacting land use regulations or environmental regulations, but they would have to pay or waive the application of the regulation on a property-specific basis. The other myth that you hear is that how costly these measures will be. In Oregon, they're talking about the opponents of these measures are saying, well, in Oregon, since Measure 37 passed, we've had over 2,000 Measure 37 claims totaling $3.5 billion, and the reality is that none of these have been paid. That basically the governments are opting to waive the regulations, to reinstate the rights that property owners had when they bought their property, giving them the benefit of their bargain. I mean, they paid their market value for their property based on a set of expectations about what they could do with it, and then, so it's only fair that if government comes along and changes the rules of the game, that government has to pay for it. So, I'll just wrap up here with a couple of comments on what these Kilo Plus measures would do. I mean, the obvious thing would be they're providing a check on government power and imposing fiscal discipline, in the sense that government would now be obliged, if these measures pass, to consider a wider range of financial impacts associated with future regulations. If you're going to go and adopt an open space ordinance, well, you're going to actually have to carefully think about what are the property rights implications and how that could play out in terms of compensation. So again, they have 2 choices. They can either waive the regulation, or they'd have to budget for the new costs in their budgets. Okay, well, we want open space, but we also have to, build a new firehouse or a new, police station. How are we going to weigh that out? So, the goal here is really to ensure that governments adequately weigh the costs and benefits of public action. Just a couple more points. Both the Kilo backlash and Measure 37, really demonstrate that as Americans, we still really care very deeply about property ownership, markets, and property rights. And the success of both of these, the response to Kilo and Measure 37, shows that, if they work well alone, well, there's a possibility that we can combine them together, and that would also work as well. And then lastly, the real deal here is that in the property rights movement, I mean, there are some critical principles here that these initiatives would forward. One, that government should only take private property for clearly defined public uses. And that's really getting back to the eminent domain, which I haven't talked about much, and which Keith is going to talk about after I do. But again, clearly defined public uses, not this ambiguous public purpose. Next, private landowners should not bear the cost of providing public goods that benefit everyone. They deserve compensation. And then lastly, like I said a second ago, landowners should get the benefit of their bargain. You buy property with a set of expectations. If government changes the rules of the game, then they should have to compensate you for that. So that's it for me. I guess we take questions afterwards.
Questions at the end.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you.